The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Policy and Practices webinar. It's great to have you here today. Today's webinar is titled Using Your Data Effectively to Identify and Prevent Vulnerability. And you're very welcome. It's lovely to see so many people here today. So just while we get our slides all lined up and ready to show you, I would like to just take a moment to welcome you on board. We haven't had a webinar for a while, so it's great to see so many people here today. We've got a great session lined up for you today, and we're delighted to have our guest speaker, Chris Parker from Newcastle City Council with us today. Devon, if you want to move the slides on.
Okay, so I've got my slides here. You can see them all, and just move on.
We can't see your slides yet, Devon. Sorry, everybody, if you just bear with us a second while we get the slides working. Here we go. Thank you. Excellent.
Sorry.
So this is where I'm at. You can tell we're not done for a while. We're in a housekeeping mode here now. So just while we wait for a few more people to join us, if you've not been on a webinar before, please have a look at the panel on the right-hand side there. This is where everything happens. So I could do an audio check just so that you can hear us fine. Please raise your digital hand in that panel. And also, if I could tell you as well that this is where you ask your questions. So please ask the questions in this panel as they come to you throughout the webinar, and we'll have time at the end to put them to Chris and to Devon. We have a couple of polls throughout. We would like your opinion on some of the things we're talking about today, and we have a survey as well, and we will be on our way by 11:30. So we have a lot to get through, so we will crack on. Thank you very much, everybody. I can see your hands are raised, so that's fantastic. Thank you for the audio check. So for anybody that hasn't heard any of our work before, it's great to see so many new faces on the webinar today. Thank you very much for joining us. Just a tiny bit about Others in Policy and Practice. We work to reduce poverty by making the welfare system easier to navigate. Our award-winning benefit and budgeting calculator is used by over 10,000 people daily. That's accessed on gov.uk. Our analytics services, which we're talking about today, help councils like Newcastle City Council find relationships in existing data sets so that they can understand the drivers of poverty affecting low-income households. And we've promoted a data-led approach to improve the design and delivery of social policy interventions since 2013. So that's a little bit about us, very broad canter through. And I think now it's lovely to see the faces to the names. So two speakers here today, Devon Galani from Policy and Practice. Devon, do you want to say hi?
Hello, everyone.
Thank you. And Chris Parker from Newcastle City Council. Chris, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, so today's agenda, we have, like I say, we have a lot to get through. We're going to talk a bit about the Homelessness Reduction Act, which I'm sure lots of people are quite familiar with right now, but it's just good to recap and look at the policy background and what the intentions of the Act are. We're then going to give a lot of time to Chris to talk about the experiences of Newcastle City Council. And then we're going to be having a look at Newcastle's LIFT dashboard, Low Income Family Tracker dashboard, because this really is the heart of the analysis machine that we've built for Newcastle. And then Devon is also going to talk a bit broadly about how other councils are approaching prevention as well. And as I say, we've got plenty of time for question and answers. So do please put those in the panel as you go through, and I'll pick them up at the end and put them to our speakers. So thank you very much. It's over to Devon now.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I just second what Janet said and say we're really looking forward to your questions too. I wanted to start by saying why are we talking so much about homelessness when we're talking about preventing vulnerability? I think that's fundamentally because homelessness can happen to anyone, and because the Homelessness Reduction Act has actually put in place a statutory duty to try and act preventatively. So I want to just kick off by using the Homelessness Reduction Act as the context for a wider approach to being more preventative, being more holistic in the type of support you're able to offer your residents. This is a picture of Mary, who spoke at an event we held at the House of Lords about almost 2 months ago now. And she is a big issue seller that's based not too far from our offices here in Westminster. And when we thought about putting the event together, we really wanted to anchor it with the voice of someone who'd just gone through the process of being homeless. So I wanted to kick off the webinar with just a few of the key messages she left us with. I think the biggest one is just to point out that anybody could end up homeless. I think one thing is that one thing Mary does is really just challenge our perceptions of who is homeless. She's incredibly articulate, obviously facing hard times at the moment and facing some challenges. But actually, from the situation where she started out, it was really just a chain of events that really could have happened to anyone. Anyone on this call, anyone who was in that room at the House of Lords, that Lord Bird firmly seconded, which is to say that, think about your own financial situation. If you were to lose your job, if you were to find yourself facing some debts mounting up, how long could you hold out? Do you have the social support network? Do you have the financial resilience to be able to sustain yourself? So I think that was the first key message. I think the second key message from her experience was that agencies need to be joined up. And one thing Mary said that I think everyone on the webinar should find encouraging is that she would have welcomed support had it been made available to her. But for her, it just wasn't offered, and she couldn't find a single point where she could get in-depth advice and get help navigating the various different agencies. In her experience, actually, this is before the Homeless Reduction Act, but she was one of the unfortunate few who found herself, when she presented herself as homeless, being told that actually she had to go to the other local authority where she used to be before, and she'd had quite a negative experience of how services had come into force, which had been there to help her. And I think that's a good case for the Homelessness Reduction Act generally. She said there needs to be a better council response. From her perspective, the council and taxpayers and all of your staff, there's a lot more money being spent on her now than there ever was when she wasn't homeless, just in terms of her day-to-day costs of living in supported accommodation. So her rent support now costs twice as much as it did in housing benefit when she was in her home before. And that every effort should be made to keep people in the home in the first instance from her perspective. Because of the knock-on consequences. One, the cost point she made earlier, but actually in terms of not having an address, having to sort of deal with the loss of possessions and the impact that then had on her mental health, meant it was even harder for her to sort of get back to an even keel. And then finally, she asked us all to challenge our perceptions of who is homeless, who could be homeless, which I think reiterates that first point. She was very articulate. She's brilliant. We still keep in touch with her. I share her lunch. This is reminding me now. We said we'd sort of catch up and think about the next steps we could take together on this journey. But I think it's worthwhile thinking a bit about how many other people you might know who are in this situation or at risk of being in this situation, and what changes you want to make to the support system to make sure that vulnerable people know about the services that are on offer and are willing and able to engage in that support. You'll be able to download the slides, or you'll be sent the slides after this, and there's a link here to the blog post which covers Mary's talk in more detail and comments that other people made as well. But I just wanted to kick off with that perspective of someone who's been through the process. We're moving on to a poll now, just to make sure. A lot of you put your hand up, but just to make sure you're all fully engaged. The poll is, what are the biggest drivers of homelessness in your area? So I'm just going to serve that now.
Devin, I've already served it there, so hopefully that should come on everybody's screen right now. Hopefully you can see that there on your screen. So Devin, if I may, so the poll is, what are the biggest drivers of homelessness in your area? And you can select all that apply. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to do this. So the options that you're given here are, is it ending of a private rented sector tenancy, ending of a social rented sector tenancy, austerity and welfare reform, personal factors such as relationships and relationship breakdowns, debt, health, physical or mental, or do you not know? Okay, I can see lots of people answering the questions. Thank you very much. I'll just give it a few more seconds. And like I say, do select all that apply to you. Great, thank you very much, everybody. I can see the majority of people have voted now. So I'm going to close the poll and show it on your screen. Okay, and share. Okay, so I'm not quite sure, Devon, whether you can see the results of the poll on your screen. You can. Excellent. Over to you.
Oh, okay, sure. So the top three really, three of the key points stand out. So the first one is personal factors, so relationships, debt, health, basic issues going on in someone's life. Austerity and welfare reform is joint second, along with the ending of a private rented sector tenancy. So those are just three of the factors that were put forward there. Chris, can I just ask you to come in briefly and comment on that from the perspective of Newcastle?
Yeah, I think it's relatively interesting to see that personal factors are so prominent. I think often the personal factors are the kind of the end of the line of the more structural factors of austerity and welfare reform. So in Newcastle in particular, we found that often the impacts of welfare reform in particular are mitigated through debt. It was supposed to be replaced through people finding work, but in Newcastle we find increasingly that they're transferred into personal debt, which is causing people to be in really difficult financial situations. Less surprising, the end of a private rented social sector tenancy is particularly prominent. It's less of a problem in Newcastle, but still very prominent. And I think that's really because of the lack of security in that sector. And not too surprising, the end of a social rented sector tenancy is so low there because of the much greater level of protection and responsibility of social landlords.
Yeah, really helpful there. Good sort of follow-up comments. If you sort of hide the results, Janet.
Yep.
We'll move on and talk a bit about what when I sort of talk a bit about the Act, I think you can see that now. I thought I'd sort of share, following on from that poll, what the sort of official drivers of homelessness were. So these are some statistics from MHCLG. So the triggers that immediately precede a homelessness application. The core drivers seem to be at the end of an assured short hold tenancy, which again was very high up on that list. And actually, there's quite a long list of potential personal factors there. So parents no longer able to accommodate, relationship breakdown, violent due to a violent spouse, loss of rented or relationship breakdown. I mean, these things the underlying factor can all be personal factors that sort of drive parents or friends no longer being able to accommodate, for example. So it's worthwhile thinking a bit about what underlies these causes. I think fundamentally thinking about what's happening to the housing sector in your area. So is there a sufficient supply of affordable or low-cost housing? We did some work across London recently for this Pan London project using housing benefit data across 18 London councils. And what we found was a gap between rent and housing benefit of 17%, which I thought was quite striking. I mean, that's quite a big gap between the housing benefit people get and the rent they have to pay, which obviously puts pressures and leads to debt. We've talked a bit about personal factors, but I think it's worthwhile also recognizing, and I think, Chris, you mentioned this when we were preparing for the call as well, is that people struggle with just the situation that they were just in. So leaving prison can lead to people turning up and saying, actually, I don't have a home. I've just left prison. I don't have a home. People with mental health issues, and actually quite a lot of young people coming through the door. Does that mirror what you're seeing with your homelessness service, Chris?
Yeah, I think it's reflected in the Homeless Reduction Act. Alongside it, we had one of the requirements for local authorities was to define their pathways for people leaving. The primary causes of homelessness, and a lot of those were people leaving what we refer to as institutions in the broadest sense. So, for instance, leaving prison, leaving mental health hospitals or secure wards, leaving physical health hospitals as well, or general needs hospitals, I suppose, leaving the care of the local authority. But also leaving the asylum system as well is quite a prominent issue for us, particularly since the Homeless Reduction Act is extended from 28 days to 56 days. The requirements of the Home Office haven't actually extended further, so the notifications only come to local authorities 28 days before, which actually is something which needs to be addressed in line with the Homeless Reduction Act in our mind.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at, I think the next slide has some of the comments from MHCLG, actually following on from this one. So, I mean, the core factors of the Homelessness Reduction Act are this prevention duty, those that are threatened with homelessness within 56 days, the relief duty for those that to help applicants to secure a suitable accommodation. And then there's also the original rehousing duty that ultimately falls into place. But I just thought I'd sort of share the MHCLG's key messages around the Homelessness Reduction Act rather than sort of go through in detail the legislation. So their core aims were that the aims of the Act were to enable people in crisis to be helped earlier, in particular for councils to have a new duty towards single person households, which just generally weren't seen as priority cases before. So that was just causing quite a lot of knock-on impacts. Local authorities and public bodies in general must help people threatened with homelessness, and this needs to be embedded in these bodies, which is why I'd second that point about you just made about the Home Office and whether or not they're meeting their own duties under this Act. They're just across the road from us here at Policy and Practice, so I might
nip across, let them know.
Say, hey, listen, I was just on this webinar.
In 56 days if you've only got 28 days when you actually get the notification that someone's leaving asylum accommodation.
There's got to be some bonuses to being where we are and paying the rent we do. So I might do that later on. I'll let you know how I get on. MHCLG made the point that local authorities don't, not all the local authorities have made it easy to sort of access that information through their website. And we're talking a bit about things local authorities can do to act proactively in this webinar too. So I mean, that's an easy win really, is to make sure your website offers some form of self-service support, which I'll go on to talk about when I talk about what other local authorities are doing. And then prior to the Act, local authority homelessness just focused on meeting the statutory duty, those that were priority needs. The change in focus toward prevention and support is a challenge and does need fundamental culture change, and I think that's again probably something you'd back fully, Chris. Would you?
Yeah, definitely. We'd say there needs to be a focus on prevention. I think something we'll go into is actually, is 56 days enough? I think it's appropriate when we're looking at the Homeless Reduction Act, but in Newcastle we would be keen, particularly when we're referring to the use of data, to try to intervene as early as possible, and that often means outside of 56 days. Often we find that people are already in a crisis when they end up in that situation.
Yeah, and as if by telepathy, that's exactly the message on the next slide. So, there is this focus on 2 months, but actually it doesn't really recognise true prevention that really should happen well before 56 days. So I think for the rest of this webinar, I would focus on the broadest view rather than just the Homelessness Reduction Act, what councils can do to take a truly preventative approach. And I thought the next bit is really just hand over to you, Chris, and tell us a little bit about the team you've put together in Newcastle and how that's working. So floor over to you, and I'll chip in. But if other people have questions, do type them in the question box too.
Thanks very much, Devin, and thanks for having me here today. I'll try to get over the fact I'm staring myself directly in the face on the screen as I talk, but I'm sure it'll be all right. So as I said, we very much see the Homeless Reduction Act as a step in the right direction, but we think that we shouldn't be limited to trying to support residents just within 56 days from when they're homeless. We find that, particularly if we talk about a loss of a shared shorehold tenancy, if someone's already got a possession order in hand or some sort of eviction notice, we would see that as a crisis you're dealing with, and you can't prevent them from becoming actually homeless. But we much rather try to intervene in an earlier stage. And just a very quick reflection on the Homeless Reduction Act. We would like the monitoring framework to allow us to return data to MHCLG that kind of reflects our early prevention work. We're still going to continue doing that, but at the minute through HCLIC we can't return that data to MHCLG. So in Newcastle we've got a culture of prevention and partnership working. We seek to prevent homelessness or financial vulnerability as early as possible. And we've extended this work through the MHCLG funded Homeless Prevention Trailblazer. So we're an early adopter authority, one of 3 across the country. And this work started in January 2017 and runs till March 2019. And that's the work we funded the work through Policy and Practice with as well. So as part of that Trailblazer, we've established a multidisciplinary team, which incorporates a housing specialist from our ALMO, who manage our council housing stock, a debt advisor and a welfare rights advisor from Newcastle City Council, and a work coach on loan from the DWP as well. The team actively case find rather than taking referrals. So I think this is us being proactive and going out to residents rather than waiting for them to come to us, because we find invariably if they come to us, they often come to us in crisis rather than the earliest possible opportunity. I think it's perfectly reasonable to do that. So we do that by using data, and we use data in different ways to identify residents who are likely to be at risk of homelessness in the future. Before collating the data across various databases to decide an individualised approach for our household as well. So we look across each of our databases we have access to in the council and do kind of a screen to see what do we know about this household, and through that, what would be the best way to approach them, and also to get an idea of what issues they face. So are they primarily debt related, benefits related, housing related? Do they need some support in seeking employment, or is it all those things, and would they benefit particularly from the multidisciplinary team approach? So we often find that we've got a wealth of information across the council, but it's in disparate places, and we don't draw all that together to one easily accessible place. We found with the team, if they're going to screen each of the databases, that's a lot of time and effort. And because we've got the Trailblazer funding, we can do that. But in day-to-day work, it's much more difficult in general. So I think just in general in working with residents earlier, there's two kind of key messages to date. So firstly, that although we're intervening as early as possible, we often find that residents are already in very challenging circumstances. So for instance, we always ask residents about their perception of their situation when we start working with them. And just give you a couple of kind of quotes to give you an idea of how residents are finding their situation. So, I find it very depressing. My money just about covers the bills, and that's all. I get anxious. I'm on a low income and I have a lot of payments to make. I feel as though I live from one benefit payment to another. If I don't get DHP again, I don't know how I'll pay the shortfall in my rent. It also means that my children do not get to do the activities they do now, which upsets me. So we're often finding that people are in really kind of difficult financial situations. And actually our screening has found that there's a lot of other associated issues as well, often domestic violence, mental health related issues, particularly around depression and anxiety, and other issues associated to the households as well. I think the second related message follows on from that. So as you go earlier, you inherently go broader as well. So we very much worked to the Prime Minister's original aim. As she launched the homeless prevention programme, she said, we want to identify and tackle the underlying issues that lead to homelessness. And we're very much taking that as the spirit of the Homeless Reduction Act and the spirit of the Trailblazer as well in trying to do that. And we often find that we can't really consider someone's housing needs in isolation. We have to also consider their financial needs, their employment-related needs, and even to some extent their mental health needs, because they directly impact on their ability to manage their finances and manage their housing situation. So we don't think the best way is to work through fragmented databases and fragmented systems, and particularly with the challenges of austerity and welfare reform, and particularly austerity. It's a challenge, but also potentially an opportunity to bring through partnership work and to work in a more kind of efficient and in a better way for our residents as well. So I think that's a kind of a summary of the multidisciplinary team. So the policy and practice dashboard, where we began to use, and I believe it was April. So we're relatively early stages, but what it's allowed us to do is draw together previously disparate databases into one easily accessible platform. And I think, we'll go through that and definitely it'll show us as we run through. But it draws together our housing benefit database, our DHP records, our council tax records, our ALMOs or YHNs, rent accounts, and it maps those against future predicted changes in inflation of household goods and predicted welfare changes, and just really gives the team an easily accessible platform to be able to go in there and see what resident situations are, pin them down relatively easily, segment residents down. But I think, just a couple of notes of caution around it, not to do with the dashboard itself. The dashboard's particularly really been very useful, and being able to access all that previously disparate data has been very useful as well. I think it's just, I really want to emphasize the importance of having an infrastructure in place around that as well. The data itself is going to point you potentially in the right direction, but if you don't have staff to be able to go out there and the resources to consider your best way of approaching residents, then really you're going to struggle. So I think Having the internal resources to identify and segment different ways of using the data and services that can screen, prioritise and approach residents, and also provide feedback to determine better ways to segment the data are really important. You know, the dashboard provides a really useful tool, but you have to have good staff using it. Yeah, so I think, you know, in Newcastle, again, we're in a relatively fortunate position. So we have quite a lot of social housing stock. Well, I say quite a lot. I think if anyone's listening from London, they'll probably be agreeing with MD that we have around 27,000 units of council housing stock. And we know more about those residents. We can tie them into services relatively easily. The residents we don't know about, and this reflects back on some of the key causes of homelessness, is those in the private rented sector. Now, I don't think we're ever going to get a database that tells us the rent accounts of everyone in the private rented sector. So we have to find kind of proxies for that. So the dashboard's been really useful and allow us to segment private rented sector tenants by other issues. So we're using council tax arrears as a proxy for rent arrears, because we often find that the debt doesn't just come in ones, it comes in twos, threes. If someone has council tax arrears, they often have maybe catalogue debts, but they also have rent arrears, for instance. So it's kind of a proxy for being able to identify it. So just before we kind of go any further and look at the dashboard itself, just kind of a final message that in the post-austerity world, so in Newcastle, that's 283 million lost from our budget by 2020, and post-welfare reforms, that's 129 million from residents in Newcastle by 2023. We can't afford to waste resources, we don't think, and our residents can't afford for us to do either, really. Their budgets are often teetering on fine margins, and in many cases, without anything more than the essentials, their outgoings now exceed their income. So our debt advice service have found around 19% of their residents are on unsustainable budgets, as they refer them. So that's just essential goods that they just basically don't have enough money to pay. So we see this kind of targeted prevention work is really the best way and the only way to stop residents falling into much more costly responses of financial vulnerability and homelessness. Dealing with a crisis, moving people to temporary accommodation is much more costly than preventing, we see as. So yeah, I think that's kind of our position. I think maybe it's appropriate now to move on to the actual dashboard and have a look at it, maybe, Devin.
Well, thanks a lot, Chris. And I think we've talked a lot about your data-led approach. I just thought I'd kick in with just 2 or 3 questions initially before we move on to kind of talking about that, because I think people will be interested in the fundamentals of how you put the team together. Because you mentioned that, again, there are some things people need to bear in mind, just to making sure that they've got those resources in place to be able to make the most of being proactive or preventative in tackling vulnerability. So how did you manage to pull the team together? What's the story behind the multidisciplinary team?
So the team follow what we refer to as the foundations of a stable life in Newcastle, which has been part of our active inclusion approach, which is the service I belong to. So life refers to somewhere to live, an income, financial inclusion and employment. And we see that as sufficient to stable someone's situation and allow them to pursue other things in their life. So we wanted to design a team that fitted around that, because we often find that residents, as I said, don't just have a housing issue, don't just have a benefits related issue, often one runs into the other. And when we have fragmented or siloed systems, and they're less fragmented in the active inclusion service with those different services within it, people still fall through gaps. And so we, using this Trailblazer funding, wanted to test the efficacy of having a multidisciplinary approach. So having 4 staff co-located in the same office. They're based in Shelter's office in Newcastle, so they're to some extent separated from council as well, and to see the benefit of those 4 working together. So my managers had quite a lot of long protracted negotiations, and we'll not go into negotiations with DWP and so on. But we eventually managed to draw those in together, and actually have had a lot of support from each of those different organisations. And then we went through a long process of the team didn't actually start taking cases for a month and a half after we'd established them, because we thought, again, co-location is one thing, but it isn't the same as integration. If we want to have these staff members working together, we have to build the structures, we have to build shared policies, procedures, ways of screening databases, ways of recording that information, and really importantly, ways of capturing the learning from the pilot as well, because if we didn't consistently and systematically capture the learning from the project, then really we wouldn't be able to draw much out of it. We just get a loose idea of how it was going. So in the first instance, we had kind of test pathways. So we had residents who we knew were affected by the benefit cap and had been previously failed to engage with other services, and also residents affected by the bedroom tax as well. And these were both residents from our ALMO. And from each of those, we targeted residents and basically let us test our approach, I suppose, to some extent. And that was from November until around March. And then around March, April, that was when we began to be able to use the dashboard to some extent as well. So we're still continuing those pathways, but increasingly we're moving on to our different ways of segmenting using the policy and practice dashboard to identify residents earlier.
And you talked a bit about starting to engage those residents, so some of those that hadn't engaged previously with other earlier efforts to engage. And you also gave some powerful quotes from the people you'd spoken to. Can you say a bit more about the lessons you've learned when whether you use the dashboard or other methods to identify households or engage households? You know, what's been their response to that? Because that's a question we often get: is how do you actually engage?
Yeah, I think with the benefit cap households and the bedroom tax households, they were more receptive because there was a quite clear hook there. We know you're affected by the bedroom tax. We know you're affected by the benefit cap. They were aware of that as well. And it's often quite a significant loss of income. So that was a bit of a hook. But having, as you said, a lot of those still hadn't previously engaged with services. So really what we did was we operate we don't close cases for non-engagement in the first instance. And really it was just about using a range of different methods that are appropriate to the household. So I say when we screen the different databases in advance of approaching households, we use that data to identify, well, is it appropriate, not just for risk, but in terms of the circumstances of the household, is it appropriate to get them to come into our office? Is it more effective if we went out to their home address? Would it be more effective, for instance, which we've done numerous occasions, to catch them at the housing office? Would it be more appropriate to catch them at the job centre appointment, which we can do through our links to DWP? So we attempted a range of different methods based on what we'd identified as the needs of that household. Hopefully that makes sense. Through the policy and practice dashboard, it's been actually a little bit more difficult to approach those households. As I say, with them being private rented sector tenants, they've been tied into services to a much lesser extent, and they're much less familiar with being approached with support. So I think we've had to really tailor what is our hook. We can't go to residents and say, we think you're at risk of homelessness, because, well, really, we found that they don't see themselves at risk of homelessness. And ultimately, it's not surprising that they don't, because they are quite far away from that, even though they're often in financially challenging situations.
Yeah.
So what we do is, as I say, have that very personalised approach and keep trying. And through that process of capturing the learning, we learn from the residents we do engage. And also we just operate a process in no case closure. So we'll continue to try until basically someone tells us to go away.
Okay. Well, that's a funny note to end on. I think you've spoken about it a couple of times. So let's talk a bit about engaging people even earlier through the dashboard itself. So I'll just come out of here and flick into this. So we've got an anonymized version of the Newcastle data set that you can see here. Do you want to just talk me through how it's just reloading. Do you want to just talk me through how you use this to identify, to work with specific households?
So we work with different routes. So we needed a relatively manageable number because there's only 4 team members. And we will want to identify different ways to segment the data after we've actually got a meeting in 2 weeks' time to identify new ways to segment the data. But in the first sense, we categorise by financial resilience, at risk now and at risk in 2020.
Okay. So I'll just explain while I'm sort of waiting for the dashboard to load what this financial resilience measure is. So this is something we've worked on with Newcastle, but is also built on by other councils too, where we look at household income. So we use their housing benefit data, the council tax support data, and the information they've provided to the council, and the other data sets, bringing all those other data sets together too around indebtedness and other pieces, and use the information we know about their income now. We model that income into the future to say what will their income be in 2020, and we also model their costs. So we know what their rents are, we know what their council tax liability is. We forecast that into the future, but we can also model a range of other costs based on using information about the household to say, and data from the Living Costs and Food Survey to say that a low-income household in Newcastle with a couple and 2 and 3 children are likely to spend about this much on household bills. And we've got a powerful algorithm that calculates all of that quite accurately for each one of these individual households. So when you're saying they're either at risk or in crisis in now or in 2020, it means that they've got less income than the needs that you'd expect that household to need in order to be able to make ends meet comfortably. So we're down from sort of 35,000 to 5,000 households.
Yeah, and then as we said, we wanted to target private tenants.
Okay, so let's look at those that are private tenants. And I think this has been quite powerful. This has been quite important to Newcastle in that you've always had, because of the large number of council homes you've had and your relationship with Your Homes Newcastle, you've always had access to council tenants in that sense, but you've never really had access to people in the private rented sector. So this gives you a view of, now you're down to 825 households in the private rented sector that seem to be struggling now and are likely to continue to struggle in the future.
Yeah, and then we as I said, we know we can't get rent arrears data for these households, so we use council tax arrears as a proxy. So yeah, in council tax arrears, and then finally we know those households. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to explain. So you're down to 400 households that in the private rented sector are in council tax arrears. But if I just say those that are more than 1 month in arrears, so you're not just dealing with those who have just sort of taken a bit longer to pay, you filtered that down further to a much more manageable number of 202 households.
Yeah, and then finally, we will know about those households to some extent who've been awarded DHP. So those who are not have not been awarded DHP. Because those get awarded DHP, we have a system in Newcastle that it's a requirement of a DHP application that they then get signposted to some form of support.
So not many of these households have already been offered support through DHPs. I think I only saw 1 or 2 households drop off when I deselected that. So this is the kind of list you'd be working with. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just sort of highlight a few things. And again, this is an anonymized data set, but I'll just show you so you can download that. So if I click here, download and hit cross tab, you can just download a list of these households have just been generated. With hidden housing benefit reference numbers in this case, but you can just then work with those households. And then also, sorry, I've lost the page now. You can drill into these households as well. So just give me 2 seconds. So council tax arrears, 1. And I'll just go through the same steps to get that same list. Sorry about this. I just wanted to drill in on one of these families. So if I just...
And I think this has been the value for us is, as I said, when I say it's easily accessible and easily usable, it is literally untick some boxes, and hopefully people can see the appeal, which we see is there's lots of different ways we can segment. So again, when I'm talking about having the internal resources, it's really important to be able to ourselves, with support from policy and practice, because you have ongoing dialogue, to be able to really think about, well, who do we want to approach, who do we think will be at risk in the future, just beyond the financial resilience measures, because already they do point us broadly in the right direction, it seems.
Yeah, so of these households, I've just drilled into one. You'd be able to see the housing benefit reference number, but that's hidden for the purposes of this webinar. They're a private rented tenant or a lone parent with 1 child, 1 non-dependent living with them. So I'll just drill in and understand a bit more about their circumstances. So I can see, you can kind of drill into where they are. You can see the same overview, but just a bit of extra information. They've got a shortfall, quite a significant shortfall it looks like. So their income versus their expenditure is pretty significant. So it's worthwhile exploring why that is. They're a lone parent, so that's one of their barriers to work. If I just click on Open in Calculator, what the multidisciplinary team can then do is just load up that record in something that actually makes sense to the individual. So this is something we haven't yet fully trialed, with Newcastle, because this is just a new feature we've built in for this version. So Chris, hopefully you're quite excited to use this. But in terms of that ability to engage those households, you can say, actually, here's some information about you, which is actually quite a good way to get engagement. All the information from the data record has been loaded up without you having to sort of go through and ask them lots of questions. You can confirm a lot of this information with them. And then very quickly get to the end result, which shows them the kind of support that they're getting right now. So £984.09 under the current benefit system. And I think the really powerful thing in terms of engagement is the ability to click here on information about your case and see some steps and some actions that the household themselves might be able to take. So you can see here, for example, that they ought to qualify for the warm home discount. Are they claiming that? If they were to move on to universal credit, this particular household would be better off. So that might be something that you can use to reassure them if they're struggling with that move to universal credit. Are they claiming everything they should be on free school meals, for example? And then those actions can be recorded. A couple of other things. So I'll just put in a Newcastle postcode. And we know this is a household that was in debt. So you can identify, for example, other places they might be able to go to for debt advice. So based on where they live, which of these places is best for them to go to. And you can start to look at, they're not currently in work, but if they were to get a job at, say, £9 an hour, 18 hours a week, this is how much better off they would be. Trying to understand what's gone wrong here. That's fundamentally the power of the calculator. I need to understand quite what's gone on with this case. But I suppose just one other point I wanted to make as I sort of flick back to the presentation is that ability to identify. So when we first did this with you, Chris, what's changed and what's improved? Because I know when we first did this, we identified quite a few households, and I think you went out to see, or your team went out to see a dozen of them, and found that only about 3 of them were really, really the kind of people, the kind of groups that you'd want to be engaging with, were kind of genuinely at risk. And there were a few there. Do you want to talk a bit through that, or shall I just carry on talking through what we did to try?
No, yeah, I can kind of reflect a little bit on that. So I think again we were naturally cautious, and again it's having that infrastructure in place through the team, because they can, and I suppose a more kind of qualitative or in-depth sense, actually go and approach the households and getting a better idea of one by one how at risk are they. And I think that's again a slight caution of the analytics are only as good as the data that goes into them. And really, in the first instance, we targeted those who were in crisis, and we screened all of them, then approached a smaller number of them. And we found with quite a lot of those, actually, the reason they were classified as in crisis was because what hadn't been pulled through from our revenues and benefits database was their savings, which it's absolutely surprising that we didn't necessarily expect these households to have a high level of savings, but quite a few of them did. And once they were accounted for, these households were definitely not in crisis. So what we were able to do is then obviously go back to yourselves through this dialogue with yourself and Taryn in particular, and actually kind of refer that back and make changes to the dashboard as well. So it's much more effective and appropriate. And I think that's, again, it's having that ongoing dialogue, but also having that resource to be thinking about it in the critical sense, appreciating the benefits of it, but also thinking, there might be a little way to improve it here, or a little tweak needed there for our local context.
Yeah, and ultimately the strength in the analytics is only as useful as you guys find it to be able to properly identify those households that you want to engage with now. So a couple of ways in which the algorithms improved just since we started working with you, Chris. So one is to bring savings data into the dashboard. We're bringing in debt information around council tax arrears, housing benefit overpayments, and rent arrears. We've started to take into account non-dependent income. So a lot of households that were struggling actually had non-dependents to help bridge that income from non-dependents to help bridge that shortfall. Those are 3 that spring to mind. But I guess the strength of working with a dozen or so councils across the UK now is that whenever they go out and test and refine, give us feedback, that's then benefits that can be used to help refine the algorithm for Newcastle too. And when we're running and testing that analysis, we're not just testing it on Newcastle's data, but we're testing it on data from other councils as well. But before I talk about what some of those other councils did, Chris, is there anything else you wanted to add, or do you want to just hold off for the Q&A?
No, yeah, we'll hold off for Q&A because people might want to ask questions. I'm sure there's other councils as well we want to talk about.
Okay, well, please do sort of type in your questions. We're just going to go into one more poll now. Janet, if you can serve the poll, it's what do you feel you need to tackle homelessness in your area, and this will structure some of the lessons that we bring in from other councils too.
Great, thank you, Devon. So you should see the poll on your screen now. As Devon says, so the title of this poll, what do you need to tackle homelessness in your area? And again, please select all of the options that apply to you. So your options are better partnership working with others, more money, more housing stock, better data sharing and insights, excuse me, and better engagement with those at risk. Great. I see lots of people. Again, I'll give you 60 seconds. I see plenty of people taking the options, doing the voting. Thank you very much. And again, as I say, do tick all that apply. Brilliant. I think most people have voted, and it's some quite interesting responses. Let me close that poll. Thank you very much, and share the results with you. Devon, can you see those on screen?
I can, yes. It looks like you all need everything. Would be
Yeah.
how that pops up. Is that about right? So I mean, I am interested that better partnership working with others came high up on the list, and then better engagement with those at risk. More housing stock. So again, more housing stock is perhaps less of a problem in Newcastle for you, Chris. But do you want to just talk about the other two and just reflect on any more lessons you have on better partnership working with others or better engagement with those at risk?
Yeah, so I think better partnership work with others. I mean, as I've noted earlier, and that is really the crux of what we see as our response to welfare reforms, to poverty, and ultimately to homelessness in Newcastle. I think homelessness is often the end of the line, but if we want to actually tackle it rather than just respond to it, we really need effective partnership working, and that's across particularly the council. But also with DWP. So we've established our homeless prevention trailblazer pilot with the Job Centre, which was in the Rough Sleeping strategy and has been promoted as good practice. And that allows us to get more information about those households who may be at risk, but also with other departments as well. So something we're increasingly trying to work towards is better partnerships with health, but also with adult social care, with children's social care as well. Because it's about appreciating the wider issues with the household. So I think better partnership working is essential if you want to actually tackle homelessness. In terms of better engagement, I think we've talked about it quite a lot. And really, the better data sharing and insights, I think, is very much related to that. I think the best way to identify those at risk is to kind of be very proactive and know about them before they know about the issues themselves. If we're constantly waiting for people to approach us, I think we're just waiting until crisis occurs. Really, I think it's natural that people don't come as soon as they spot an issue, and they often wait until it gets to something a bit bigger, or they just don't notice at all that they're really in much of a financially difficult situation because they haven't experienced that shock that leads them into homelessness yet. The more housing stock, of course, and more money would always be nice, because more money is quite essential to do the other things, maybe with the exception of partnership working.
Great. I mean, thank you so much. I think they're very helpful lessons, Chris, and I'm sure people with their follow-up questions will want to sort of dive into it in a bit more detail. They touch on some of the points that I just wanted to share from a couple of other councils. So Ian Swift came along to our homelessness prevention event at the House of Lords, and he got called out, especially by MHCLG, for some powerful work that Southwark have done. They were an early trailblazer, which meant that they implemented the Act earlier than others. So they had a head start on everyone, but I think went very gung-ho with it. I thought I'd just share a couple of the lessons that Ian shared with us. They halved the number of people that needed statutory rehousing, which meant that they were able to save 8,200 for the 676 cases that were no longer needing that service. That's quite a lot of money. I can't do the maths quickly in my head. Janet, if you just get your calculator out and say how much that is, I think it will be interesting to people. They no longer have any households in B&Bs, and they doubled the number of preventative outcomes. So I think that's very good reason for being called out. But we followed up with Ian and just asked him what he'd done to make that different. So some lessons for you guys to take away. Senior buy-in helps around the prevention approach. Data is important. So support or prevention agencies being able to, are they able to access correct data? I think he was particularly interested when we spoke to him about bringing other data sets into the LIFT dashboard. And those are conversations that we're having now around children's services, children leaving care, mental health, other areas which obviously require greater permissions, and they're sort of quite big leaps to take. But I think there's a lot of value in doing what you can now and then building on it stage by stage. That's how policy and practice has grown, and I think that's a very safe and secure method, because it means there's value at each stage rather than over promising and under delivering. I think the next point was that culture is important. So to make sure your team's committed to a customer first approach, and don't underestimate what it takes for that to happen. So if you're working with your existing homelessness prevention team, a lot of feedback you get is just that mental thought of, are you priority need or not, is just the first thing that comes to people's mind. And sort of changing that, shifting that around is actually quite challenging. I think partly because of the squeeze. Some have done it. So Newcastle, I think you did it by having this new team, the multidisciplinary team. You have that sort of more custom-oriented approach, and a lot of councils do it that way. Is that right, Chris?
Yeah. There's also quite a lot of other work going on. So in our housing advice centre, we've really tried to use the Homeless Reduction Act as a catalyst for having that more, and even more, because I think we had it to a certain extent, customer focused, or person centred approach, I suppose, if you put it in different terms. And yeah, there's other work going on in other parts, but the multidisciplinary team is very much through capturing the learning, leading on that culture and what actually it looks like in reality.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. That Luton have come in and we've done some work with Luton, but we brought in a service design agency, UsCreates, who some of you may know. I know you've worked with them before, Chris, as well, to help with that culture change. In Southwark, I think just the squeeze on the service meant that they had to lose some people, and they thought very hard about who they wanted to sort of stay in that service, and who they, when they were thinking about that sort of transformation that they had to undergo, who they wanted to sort of keep within that new service. So I think that's also worthwhile thinking about. Just conscious of time, but I wanted to share a few lessons from the work we've done with Luton as well. Very similar scale to Newcastle, but very much trying to take that even earlier approach to prevention. So just a quote here from Nikki Middleton, who we work with there, who's been absolutely fantastic and really gets all of this. When we don't avoid it, it's not only expensive, but the cost to individuals is considerable. That means that interventions themselves are less effective, but engagement later on becomes much harder. It makes no sense at all for us to wait until someone's at the point of crisis. So we've been working them on taking an even earlier approach to prevention. And I think, Chris, you sort of said when you've tried to do that through the dashboard, it's been difficult to engage people because sometimes they don't recognize quite how much difficulty they're in. They're just like, oh, it's just the council tax arrears, I'll deal with that. And that might be... Go on.
I was just going to say, but I think that's more just about us because we're learning, because we're going in earlier stages. It's about us really changing the offer to those people and how we approach them. And that's the benefit of having the Trailblazer money and the dashboard and the multidisciplinary team, is that we can start to test and learn what are the best ways to approach people early.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to share some of the lessons. Good to share it with you as well, actually. That Luton have picked up. So one was, they thought quite hard about how to contact customers. So they've kind of made it very clear. So they've done some work on getting the communication right. So this is some work they did with UsCreates on how to do that outreach at scale. We're about to put a self-service version of the benefit and budgeting calculator that you saw earlier onto their website, and this will link directly into, so people can kind of use that service themselves. And they've been very much marketing it as a what's in it for me, what's in it for the person. Really, it's not always been, we think you're at risk of homelessness, but we think we can help you to build your financial resilience or just be better off in some cases by reducing cost or having a conversation with them about employment. But financial, employment or housing issues are what we can help you with. And it's been quite an conversation. Luton's biggest challenge, so they've got lots of rich data. A lot of local households have already shown up to the authority before, so they know quite a bit about them. We've been helping them to draw this information together. And again, another quote from Nikki: we know this works. We know the level of need and demand, but we can't always resource the support. They've been able to do it again through the Trailblazer funding. We know we need to provide this evidence that it's going to save us, and it's going to save the DWP and other central government departments a lot of money in the long term. It's cost effective, but we still need to make the case. So we've been working with them on when they intervene early through the service they've developed through the Trailblazer. We're also evidencing its impact to help build that business case for prevention, because they're very conscious that once this Trailblazer funding goes, they need to be making that case internally to say actually prevention works, which is still, I think, in this situation, a lot of councils and local areas of organisations are finding themselves in. You still need to be able to make that case, particularly when these sort of one-off pots of funding go. If you're going to actually really make that difference and get adopted across the council a bit more fully. So, Chris, have you got any thoughts you wanted to add on just that last point about sustainability?
Yeah, it's something we're really kind of focusing on as well, and that's part of that, having that role of capturing the learning and drawing out the evidence. Is we very much see it's a pilot, so we urge MHCLG and to other authorities to draw the learning out, but it also puts us in the best position to try evidence the benefits of what we're doing. Of course, an underlying issue of doing preventative work is it's often difficult to prove that these people definitely would have ended up in these situations, but we can say with quite a lot of confidence that they would have, and we can also say with quite a lot of confidence that it would be much more expensive if they were, for instance, to go into temporary accommodation. And I think, just following on from what Ian said and Southwark, really, the really important is having that constant and consistent dialogue with particularly cabinet members and senior people in the council, and particularly councillors. We have a really good relationship with our deputy leader and other senior cabinet members, who we've invested a lot of time and effort in them getting it, of understanding our approach and what we do. And that's although we've been subject to cuts, protected quite a lot of our resource. And really the strength of that is drawing them into steering groups, drawing them into meetings, allowing them to chair them, and then servicing those really well with the learning and the data from our approaches to evidence that it does work.
Yeah, thank you. And I think highlights from other councils, I thought this is a good point to move on to Q&A really, but just 2 quick points. I'd just second that point about a lot of councils we worked with have used the LIFT dashboard to show cabinet members what they're doing, because it just really brings it to life, and a lot have been able to use that to sort of make that argument itself for the additional resource, definitely. And yeah, it was probably best to move on to Q&A actually, because I'm just conscious of time. Janet, do you want to just pick up some of the questions that have come our way?
Yes, I will indeed, Devon. Thank you very much. And actually, I've got my colleague Donna Gallagher on standby, and she has a question and a point to talk about in relation to the link with housing associations. So if I may, I'm going to unmute Donna now, and hopefully, Donna, you can ask your question. Donna, I think you might need to unmute yourself. Right, okay. Donna, are you there?
I am, Janet. Thank you. Morning, all. So a recent question that we've been getting here at Policy and Practice is how housing providers can use this information. And I think part of the answer on the poll was really interesting at the last one, Janet, about how partnership working is really key. And I know from personal experience when working for a housing provider that when using this data, it can inform income strategies, it can do targeted work, and also do a lot of prevention work. And it would be, a message that quite a lot of housing providers are asking at the minute is how can we work with local authorities to support them in wider homelessness prevention agendas. And I think just building those relationships is key. So this isn't just a service offered just for local authorities. You can bring other people into it as well, which then makes the data a lot more rich and obviously the end result and outcome better off for the resident and customer of that particular area. So I think that's just something that's been popping up quite a lot recently.
Brilliant, Donna. Thank you. Thank you very much. Chris, anything to add to that?
No, I think I completely agree. We try to do that through various different forums and to try and draw in as much data as we can from different providers in the city to get the best picture of homeless prevention in the city. And really, that's where we see the role of the local authority, particularly going forward. I mean, I'll say in that post-austerity, post-welfare reform, post-localism world, is to provide that place-based leadership and coordination to draw those things together and really get a picture across the city of providers and provide the infrastructure to help each provider and charities to work in the best way to support residents.
Brilliant. I'm very conscious. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Donna. I'm very conscious of the time here. I'm 2 minutes over, and I did promise to have you on your way. I have a number of really interesting questions that have come through. I would take the view that I think to some degree, hopefully, we have covered them, but we will get back to you offline after the webinar to you individually with your questions. So if I may move on. Actually, I'm going to finish with one last question to you, Chris, if I may. What advice would you give to somebody, either from yourself and from a council point of view, or perhaps just thinking about from a housing association, if they were thinking of following your approach? What advice would you give to somebody?
Do your best to plan out in advance, as I say, have the appropriate infrastructure in place, and spend time really considering how you're best going to use firstly the data if you're going for the predictive analytics approach, and as I say, you need to have that infrastructure in place, and that infrastructure needs to be have the right culture around it. It has to have the right structures in place. It has to be effectively integrated if it's multidisciplinary. So really, you know, time and effort to invest in the planning to do it appropriately, rather than, which I'm sure others won't do, but the idea that the data will just be the savior and point you completely in the right direction immediately.
Excellent, brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris, and I'm sure people will find that very, very interesting. So the next steps then, we're coming to the close of our webinar now. If I could just point you, thank you very much everybody for joining us. There are a couple of downloads in the panel on the right hand side that you can download before the webinar closes. So there's a flyer just talking a little bit more about the dashboard that we talked about today, and also there's a freebie there, our universal credit roadmap, just as a freebie for you. We will have a very short survey that will be served at the end of this webinar, and would really value your feedback, please, if we may. There's just a chance for you to also ask further questions and clarifications, and also if you want to have I know we've only really touched the surface, but if you want to have another look in depth at a LIFT dashboard and play around with it yourself, as Chris said, it's just tick boxes. It's very usable, and have a look. Please do to raise your hand there. We also did a user group meeting from all of our LIFT dashboard clients recently, and if you'd like to receive the briefing note from that, then please do say. And also, if I may, I'm just going to give a shout out to those of you in the north of the country. We'll be having an event later on in October, and we're basing it in Leeds. And we have got some keynote speakers from DWP and MHCLG, Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. We're going to be talking very much about universal credit and managed migration, and also about the Housing Homelessness Reduction Act as well. Do look out for that invitation, and we would love to see you there on the day as well. That'll be a chance for you to give feedback and say what you think needs to change about these policies. And these are our contact details on screen. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. And thank you particularly to our speakers, Devin Gilani, and also to Chris Parker from Newcastle City Council. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
And thanks very much, Chris. It was brilliant hosting this with you. And so sorry we didn't get through all of those questions, but we will follow up separately. Have a great rest of the day. And if you have anything you think of afterwards, don't hesitate to get in touch.